Florence, late 15th century, the streets were still beautiful. Marble facades glowed in the Tuscan sun. Bells rang over crowded piazzas. Painters mixed pigments. Sculptors chipped away at stone. Merchants argued over silk and spice. But behind the walls of the palazzi, something had gone terribly wrong. In rooms where ledgers once overflowed with profit, clerks now whispered, ink dried on unpaid bills. Couriers arrived with bad news from distant cities. London Bruges, Avignon each, message more urgent than the last. Gold had stopped moving, not slowly, not gradually, but suddenly. For generations, Italian banks had been the beating heart of Europe's economy. Money flowed outward from Florence, Venice, Genoa, and Milan, like blood from a living organ. Kings borrowed, popes borrowed, princes borrowed. Even wars were financed with Florentine credit. Now, the flow was reversing. Debtors weren't paying, depositors were asking questions. And trust, the invisible pillar holding the entire system upright, was beginning to crack. In one banking house after another, partners gathered around tables, heavy with paperwork and dread. They spoke in careful voices, calculating losses that could not be recovered. Some stared silently at columns of numbers that no longer added up, because this wasn't a normal downturn. This was a systemic failure. What was collapsing wasn't just a bank or even a family fortune. It was the financial architecture that had funded cathedrals, sponsored artists, and turned small Italian city-states into global powers. And as the money disappeared, something else began to fade with it. Patronage, innovation, confidence. The Renaissance, often remembered as a triumph of art, genius, and human potential, was also an economic miracle. And miracles, when their foundations rot, fall harder than empires. This is the story of how Europe's most advanced financial system imploded from within, and how the collapse of Italian banking quietly strangled the Renaissance that depended on it. Long before stock exchanges, central banks, or paper money, Italy invented something far more powerful: trust written in ink. By the early 1300s, the Italian city-states had built a financial network unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Florence, Venice, Genoa, and Milan were not just trading hubs, they were financial command centers. Their bankers created instruments that modern capitalism still relies on today: bills of exchange, double-entry bookkeeping, letters of credit, and international clearing systems. A merchant in Bruges could pay a Florentine banker. That banker would settle accounts in Paris. Gold might never physically move, but value did. This was revolutionary. Moving large amounts of gold was dangerous, slow, and expensive. Bandits, pirates, storms, and political seizures made physical transfer risky. Italian bankers solved this by turning reputation into currency. A signature from a respected Florentine house could move fortunes across borders. At the center of this web were powerful banking families. The Bardi, Peruzzi, Acciaiuoli, and later the Medici did not simply store money, they created liquidity. They financed kings, underwrote PayPal campaigns, stabilized currencies, and funded wars. In return, they received interest, political influence, and monopolies over trade and taxation. Europe ran on Italian credit. The papacy relied on Florentine banks to collect tithes from across Christendom. Monarchs relied on them to pay armies before taxes arrived. Even crusades were, in many ways, financed through Italian balance sheets. Florence, in particular, became the nerve center of this system. Its gold, Florence-stable, reliable, and trusted, circulated from England to the Levant. Cities that controlled credit controlled destiny. But this system had a fatal weakness. It depended entirely on confidence. There was no lender of last resort, no central authority to absorb shocks, no safety net when kings defaulted or wars went badly. Italian banks operated on thin margins, reinvesting deposits aggressively. They assumed that rulers would honor debts. They assumed trade would continue. They assumed peace or, at least, predictable conflict. They were wrong. When everything worked, the system generated astonishing wealth. It paid for cathedrals, universities, and the early careers of artists who would later define the Renaissance. But when it failed everywhere at once, because the same networks that spread prosperity also spread collapse fast. And by the mid-14th century, the first cracks were already forming in the Golden Web. Not because Italians lacked intelligence or ambition, but because they had tied their future to rulers who could not and would not repay what they owed. The collapse did not begin in Italy. It began in the courts of kings. By the early 1300s, Europe's monarchs had discovered a dangerous truth. Italian bankers could finance wars faster than taxes ever could. Armies could be raised now, not after harvests. Castles could be built immediately. Mercenaries could be paid on credit. And so rulers borrowed enormously. No king borrowed more recklessly than Edward III of England. When Edward launched his campaign against France in what would become the 100 Years' War, he needed staggering sums of money. Ships, armor, wages, bribes, everything demanded gold. English tax revenues were slow and unreliable. Italian credit was fast. Florentine banks stepped in. The great houses of Bardi and Peruzzi advanced the English crown sums equivalent to millions of modern dollars, backed not by collateral, but by royal promises. Wool revenues, customs duties, future taxes all pledged against loans already spent. On paper, it looked manageable. England was rich in wool, trade was booming. Victory in France would secure repayment many times over. Reality was different. The war dragged on. Campaigns stalled, revenues failed to arrive. And then, in 1340, Edward III did the unthinkable. He stopped paying. This was not a missed installment. It was a total sovereign default. England simply declared that it could not and would not repay its Italian creditors. The shockwaves were immediate. The Bardi collapsed first, unable to cover their obligations. The Peruzzi followed soon after. These were not small firms. They were the financial pillars of Florence itself. Their failure wiped out merchants, craftsmen, monasteries, and entire families who had deposits tied to those banks. Florence froze, credit vanished overnight, trade stalled, workshops closed, unemployment surged. The city that had once fueled Europe's economy suddenly found itself fighting to survive, and England was not alone. France delayed payments, Naples defaulted. The papacy squeezed its bankers harder. One by one, the pillars of trust that held the system together cracked. This was the fatal flaw of medieval finance. Kings could always default, bankers could not. There were no courts to enforce repayment against monarchs, no international system to discipline sovereign debt. When rulers chose power over promises, the banks absorbed the loss and died. The Italian Renaissance did not collapse in a single moment. It began bleeding here in the silence left behind by broken contracts, and the realization that art, trade, and innovation could not survive without stable credit. Just as Italy's banking system staggered from royal defaults, something far worse arrived: death in 1347. Merchant ships docked in Messina, carrying more than silk and spices from the east. They carried the Black Death, a plague that would erase nearly half of Europe's population within a few years. For finance, the timing could not have been more catastrophic. Banks depend on movement of people, goods, payments, and promises. The plague stopped all of it. Cities emptied, trade routes collapsed, markets closed. Entire households of bankers, clerks, and merchants vanished in weeks. Records were abandoned, mid-century contracts became meaningless when one party or both was already dead. Confidence, already shaken by defaults, now evaporated completely. Depositors rushed to withdraw what little remained. But banks did not keep idle gold in vaults. Their money was lent out of and overseas, often unrecoverable. What could not be withdrawn turned into panic, riots, and rage against lenders who suddenly appeared powerful yet helpless. In Florence, Siena, and Venice, financial paralysis followed biological catastrophe. Governments responded not with coordination, but with desperation. Cities imposed price controls, wage freezes, and debt moratoriums. Some suspended repayments entirely. Others forced banks to convert deposits into long-term government bonds, effectively locking savers into losses. The result was systemic collapse. Where once credit flowed through trust and reputation, now only coercion remained. Merchants hoarded coin. Trade reverted to barter. International exchange, Italy's greatest advantage, fractured into isolated local economies. And unlike previous crises, this one had no recovery mechanism. There was no central bank to inject liquidity, no state strong enough to stabilize markets, no theory explaining how to respond. Medieval finance had reached its limits. The very tools that had built Italian dominance, complex credit chains, international exposure, reliance on confidence, now accelerated its destruction. A single failure no longer stayed local. It cascaded. Florence survived, but diminished. Siena never recovered. Genoa retreated into maritime trade. Venice turned inward, tightening control rather than expanding innovation. The Renaissance did not end, but its momentum broke. What followed was a century of caution, consolidation, and Fiero world less willing to risk bold investment, less able to fund experimentation, and far more suspicious of bankers who had once been celebrated as heroes of progress. The banking disaster did not kill art overnight. It starved the system that had fed it. Out of the ruins, one family appeared to succeed where all others had failed. The Medici. By the early 1400s, Florence's economy was scarred but not dead. Trade had shrunk, banks had vanished, and confidence was fragile. Yet this vacuum created opportunity for those who had learned from catastrophe. The Medici Bank was not built like its predecessors. It avoided massive sovereign loans. It diversified geographically. It focused on PayPal, finance, currency exchange, and trade credit rather than war funding. At least at first, under Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, the bank grew cautiously. It used separate branches to isolate risk, limiting contagion if one failed. It relied on bookkeeping, precision, and political neutrality rather than imperial ambition. For a time, it worked. Florence stabilized, artists returned, workshops reopened, credit cautiously flowed again. The Renaissance found its second wind funded, not by reckless expansion, but by controlled patronage. But success bred illusion. As the Medici rose politically, the bank followed power once more. PayPal connections deepened, foreign branches expanded, royal clients returned bringing prestige and danger with them. By the late 15th century, the Medici Bank was repeating the same pattern that had destroyed the Bardi and Pertuzzi. Unpaid loans, overextended branches, political interference replacing financial discipline. When kings delayed payments, losses mounted. When popes changed, contracts vanished. Internal mismanagement and corruption spread as relatives replaced professionals. By 1494, the Medici Bank collapsed. Quietly, almost there was no dramatic run, no sudden crash. The system had learned to fail slowly. But the consequences were final. Florence lost its last major international bank. Financial leadership shifted north to Augsburg, Antwerp, and eventually Amsterdam and London. Italy remained culturally brilliant, but financially sidelined. The Renaissance continued artistically, but economically, the center had moved. Banking evolved elsewhere, shaped by lessons Italy had paid for in blood, plague, and bankruptcy. Northern Europe built institutions with stronger state backing, better risk management, and emerging central authority. Italy had pioneered capitalism, others would perfect it. The disaster was not ignorance, it was being first. The Italian Renaissance was not killed by a lack of genius, but by a financial system too advanced for the political reality it depended on. The Italian Renaissance is remembered for its art, its philosophy, and its brilliance. But beneath the frescoes and marble stood something far more fragile. What killed Italy's financial dominance was not incompetence or corruption alone. It was a mismatch between economic sophistication and political reality. Italian bankers built a system that assumed contracts would be honored, rulers would act rationally, markets would self-correct. None of those assumptions survived contact with power. Kings defaulted because they could. Cities panicked because they had no tools. Banks collapsed because there was no backstop. Finance had outrun governance. The lesson is brutal and timeless. When a financial system grows faster than the institutions meant to regulate and protect it, collapse becomes inevitable. Innovation without enforcement is fragility disguised as progress. Italy invented modern banking, but had no nation-state strong enough to defend it. No central authority to stabilize shocks. No lender of last resort. The city-states competed instead of coordinating, fragmenting strength when unity was needed most. And so the center of gravity moved. First to the German banking houses, then to Dutch commercial empires. Finally to England, where the painful lessons of Italian failure would shape the Bank of England, national debt markets, and imperial finance. Ironically, Britain would later repeat Italy's mistake, falling in love with financial symbols instead of productive reality. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. The true tragedy of the Italian Renaissance is not that it ended, but that it ended unnecessarily. Its collapse was not caused by war or invasion, but by decisions made in ledgers and councils, far from battlefields and workshops. Civilizations are not destroyed by lack of talent. They are destroyed when money stops serving people land, people start serving money. The banking disaster did not just kill Italy's dominance, it rewrote the rules of global power. And every empire that followed, British, American, or otherwise, has lived under those rules ever since.